Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a review of a book that took me 2 months to read because I didn't want it to end. And it was epic, it was grand, it was incredible, and the book I'm going to be talking about is Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa. I finished this book at the time that I'm recording this video about 2 weeks ago, and I've been delaying my filming of the review because I don't think that I can ever do justice for how incredible this book is, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try and at least give you a flavour of why I love this book so much and why I think you should read it. What is Musashi about? Musashi is about a real life character who went by the same name, Miyamoto Musashi. It is a story about a young man in his quest to be the best at his craft. It is about the journey of this very immature, very impatient young boy, I guess to an extent, and his journey to be the best samurai that has ever lived. And it is absolutely phenomenal. It's a very simple premise. We get a wide cast of characters, we journey across all over Japan, and we get a little bit of historical context in it as well. It's one of these books that has a bit of everything. It reminds me a lot of The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, which, if you've been watching my channel even for a little while, you will know that that is my favourite book of all time. And I have to say, Musashi by Eiji Yoshikawa has got to be up there, on par even with The Three Musketeers, because I just loved every single thing about it. I'm not going to go ahead and say that just yet because I've only read it one time. I've read The Three Musketeers probably about 10-15 times now, so I can say with conviction that is one of my favourite books of all time, but I've only read this once and I'm definitely going to do a reread of it probably next year or the year after that, and then I think I'll be able to say with conviction where it kind of stacks up compared to The Three Musketeers. The fact that it even has the potential to be on par with The Three Musketeers must at least indicate to you all how much I love this book. And I'm going to try and keep it fairly concise. I'm going to try and keep this video not too long, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So let's get started. So I gave you a little bit of an insight into the plot. Very simple premise. We're following a young naive man as he journeys to become the best samurai to have ever lived. This book is set after the Battle of Sekigahara, which was a very, very critical battle during the unification of Japan. The reason why Musashi is such a well-known individual is because not only was he considered to be one of the best swordsmen who have ever lived, so he actually pioneered multiple fighting styles. The one that he is most known for is fighting with two swords, which at that point in time was basically non-existent. So he would fight with a katana and also with a wakizashi. And a wakizashi is a smaller sword, whereas a katana is it's a full-length sword. This is one of the things that I found so interesting, and I will come onto this more later on when I talk about Musashi, but he really learnt from so many different schools of thought when it came to sword fighting, but he ultimately took the best of all of these different schools of thought and made his own from that, and I thought that was really fascinating. But anyway, I'm already getting into what I loved about the book, so let's just get started. In terms of the writing, this is an epic through and through. When I think of epic stories, I think about things like The Lord of the Rings, The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo. These really epic stories that tend to be very character-centric, that tend to be focused on these individual motivations and their journeys to becoming the version of themselves that we are on the kind of sidelines hoping that they will become. And Musashi is that. It is an epic through and through. The prose is absolutely stunning. Obviously, this is a Japanese translation into English, so unfortunately, I don't think I will have the skills to read Musashi in Japanese anytime soon. Maybe in a few years' time, and that's kind of actually the goal that I'm working towards. But I think a good translation has to have good source material, and I think the translator of this story did a really wonderful job of capturing the essence of what makes this book really, really special. I can't even imagine how much more special it feels when you're reading the Japanese version, because there's lots of sayings in Japanese that just don't translate well into English, and I have a feeling I missed out on a lot of that, but I'll take what I can get for now. The only thing that I will say in terms of the writing style and the way that Yoshikawa wrote the pacing of the story, it does meander in places. So the copy that I have is a 1200 page book. The font is tiny. It must be like size 8, size 9 font, and the pages are really, really thin. And the book is actually split into 7 books, so you can actually read just one book and then come back to the next book in a couple of months' time. But it's an epic, and I wanted to read it as you should read an epic, and that was, I read it back to back, and I read it very, very slowly to the point where I was taking notes. I don't actually have my edition, it's downstairs in my library, but it is so heavily tabbed, so heavily tabbed. And I actually wrote in the book some of my own thoughts and reflections, because this book to me was like a philosophical manual on how to live your life. And again, if you've been watching my channel at all, and you'll know that I love philosophical writing, like I love when there's philosophical themes packed into my books, and this is just a manual of philosophy, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I personally think that while the pacing may not work for everybody else, because like I said, there were these parts that meandered, for me it worked perfectly. I love quiet moments. I love the moments where we just get Musashi sat down reflecting on the events that have happened in the chapter before or a few chapters before, and I just love his inner reflections. I love the other characters' inner reflections that we get as well. And even though this is really a story about him, there is this really wonderful secondary cast of characters that I will come onto in a second. The other thing that I will mention about this book is that it is very political in nature. There's a lot to do with individual journeys. It just has everything. Like, it really does. There's this bigger kind of theme of finding yourself and finding your path. But then we have these little subplots, and they all kind of converge into this master plot, and it was just perfect. Absolutely perfect. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the world building as an extension of the writing. You know, as part of this book, we travel all over Japan. We go from Harema to Kyoto to Kyushu. We go to Osaka to modern day Tokyo, which at that point was called Edo. And at that point, Edo was just starting. So this was kind of late 16th century into the early 17th century. And so Edo was very, very young. It was just barely becoming a city. It was more like a village, actually, and it was starting to become a city at that point. So we see the foundation of modern day Tokyo being built, and I just thought it was absolutely wonderful, and how it already started to have this cosmopolitan feel, even though it was actually just this really small village, especially when you compare it to modern day Tokyo now. And because we are traveling so much in this book, there is always that concern that every single little village that we go to is going to feel the same, but that is not true. Every single village felt unique, felt different, had its own vibe, had its own atmosphere. We also, whenever we go to a new village with Musashi or any one of the other characters, we get introduced to another kind of tertiary set of characters. And I just really loved getting that insight into how these people perceive the other characters and where they're from and their journeys. It felt really authentic to me. It felt like this is a story about real people living real lives, which to an extent is true because Musashi is a real person. But at least from what I understand, a lot of the secondary cast of characters are either somewhat fabricated or loosely based on other people in Musashi's life. But the point is that it doesn't really matter, because these people do feel real. They do feel like they have their own backstories and their own motivations. And I just love that. Notice how I just went straight onto characters, because as we all know, I love characters. But in terms of the historical context, I mentioned that this book is set after the Battle of Sekigahara. So it's set at the tail end of the 16th century into early 17th century Japan. And this was actually when the Sengoku period ended. And that was when there was a lot of discourse around like unifying Japan. And if you watch my African Samurai review, you'll probably remember some of the bits that I said there. Sengoku period was essentially a time where there was a lot of strife between the daimyos, who are essentially like lords in a way, and the battle between Tokugawa Ieyasu and then the Toyotomi clan. And the bulk of the Toyotomi clan ended up actually defecting, and that led to Tokugawa winning. Tokugawa didn't actually become shogun for another few more years because of other stuff that was happening, but people call this the unofficial beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate. So it's really interesting to kind of see this history play out in this book after reading the African Samurai, because they're set during very, very similar times, and I thought that was really cool. I quite liked having the little Easter eggs from both, but it's set in one of the most pivotal times of Japan's history and such a formative part of Japan's history. And so we get this kind of who's who of Japanese history. And as somebody who's very interested in that period, and just Japanese history in general and culture in general, it was just a dream for me. Now let's move on to my favourite part, and that is the characters. There are so many characters in this book that are just fascinating, each in their every way. I'm only going to talk about 5 or 6. I could honestly talk about 20, but for the sake of this video, I'm only going to talk about 5 or 6. And we have to start with none other than Miyamoto Musashi. At the start of this book, his name is Takezo. He ends up changing his later on in the book to basically create a new identity for himself when he realizes what he actually wants in life. When we start with him, he's very immature, very brash, doesn't really know what he wants. He's just kind of a lost soul and is kind of trying to figure out. I'm not going to really talk too much about the journey that he goes through because you really need to experience that for yourself. But by the end of the book, he is this legend. He's this man that people fear. He is this man that people respect. And even though he has a very odd way of going about things, people do see him as someone to be admired and someone to respect and someone to put on a pedestal, I guess. And it's just really refreshing to see the journey that Musashi goes through. I personally really identified with Musashi in ways that I just did not anticipate. I've read a bit of Musashi's philosophy prior to reading this book, and a lot of it really resonated with me personally. But then reading the journey of this younger man as he gets older, up to about, I think it's his early 30s, I think we get up to. He's lived such a rich life by the time that he gets to his early 30s. He's experienced so much life, met so many people, done so many things. Just hearing his thoughts about that and about how ultimately none of it really matters, and the fact that he's doing it in service of curiosity and learning and to be the ultimate samurai. So doing it for the intrinsic value of just doing something, which I feel like people don't do at all these days. I feel like people do things because they're going to get something out of it, because they're going to ultimately get some sort of reward, whether it's monetary or praise or whatever it may be. People generally do things for that now. He does it purely for unselfish reasons. He does it because he wants to be the best version of himself, so that he can live a fulfilling life according to Buddha and according to his own belief system, because he has very much his own belief system that he develops over time. And so that idea of doing something for the intrinsic value of doing that thing and to develop oneself to that extent is just something that I have never really been able to express in words. And he did it in a way that just sung to my soul and made me learn a lot about myself as I went through this journey with him. So that was just really incredible, and he has become one of my favorite characters of all time as a result. Like, I honestly just can't explain like how much I found this person's struggle and his journey so relatable, even though our stories are so different, obviously. But I think a lot of the mental and spiritual struggle that he goes through is something that a lot of people can identify with, even though the times are very different. So Musashi, without doubt, is the shining star of this book. Everything centers around him, and rightly so. The next character I'm going to talk about is a much more conflicting character. We have Honiden Matahachi. So Matahachi is the best friend of Musashi when they're younger. They end up not being friends again, and it's because drama ensues. I'm not going to say what the inciting incident is because I don't want to spoil it, but it basically leads to a lot of tension between them for about 10 years, maybe even longer than that. And a lot of that struggle in their relationship comes from Matahachi because he's so jealous and he's envious. And Matahachi, he's an average guy, you know, he doesn't have a particular strength. He's not a particularly good fighter. He's not super intelligent. He's basically not the things that Musashi is. And he envies him, and he wants to take things from him that he believes he has power over. And I just found their dynamic so fascinating because he is the antithesis of Musashi in so many ways. Because if he actually tried to be a better person and to be curious, he could probably get to a level where he could at least be in the same sentence as Musashi. But because of that envy and that jealousy, it consumes him in a way that almost destroys him. And I never really felt bad for him because I honestly think a lot of it he brought on himself. But I think when we get his reflections at the end of the book, you can understand to an extent. I think for me, less so. But I think depending on what you're like as a person, maybe you'll be able to at least have some empathy for him or some sympathy for him, depending on your personality. But Matahachi is so different from my own lived experience that I'm probably a lot more tough on him than I would be on any other character, because he's just nothing like me. But he's still very compelling and very morally grey as well. And I would say Musashi is a little bit morally grey too. He definitely has questionable tactics sometimes, but it feeds into this greater philosophy that he has, and that's why I'm a little bit more softer on him, I guess, in that regard. But with Matahachi, I think a lot of it is unforgivable, but I don't know. If you've read this book, let me know what you think down below. The next character that I'm going to talk about is one of the female characters that we follow in this book, and her name is Otsu. Otsu is just the purest soul to have ever lived, and I just feel for her because she goes through a lot. She loves Musashi. We find this out right at the start of the book, and this story is about her love for Musashi and about unrequited love, but then also about love where you know the other person does love you, but because they think they have a greater purpose, they're not going to prioritize you. And she just goes through everything, and she gets vilified. She's often positioned in a way where she is seen as a woman of very bad means, and it's totally undeserved, and she gets a lot of shit basically, and it's so unfair. And she has a good ending at the end, and I was very happy for her, but the journey that she gets through to get there, it almost destroyed me, like genuinely. The next one I'm going to talk about is the villain of this story, and that is Sasaki Kojiro. Kojiro is probably a name that you've heard of if you've read any kind of Japanese literature. If you played Ghost of Tsushima, Kojiro's name actually comes up in the game a number of times. Surprisingly enough, Musashi's name doesn't, which I thought was really interesting and jarring. But Kojiro's name does actually come up quite a few times. Kojiro is a samurai himself. He's a very privileged samurai. He comes from a position of privilege. His family are very rich. They're very well known. The name of Kojiro is very famous. You know, he went to the academy, or the equivalent of academy, when he was younger, and he got a lot of training. Very different to Musashi. Musashi had to learn a lot by himself and force himself into situations. But for Kojiro, doors opened because he's Kojiro, and because of his family, and because of his name. And so we have this really interesting contrast between Musashi, who's this kind of self-made man, I guess is what you would call it today, and then you have Kojiro, who is the definition of privilege. And I really loved that kind of juxtaposition between the two characters, because we see the struggle that Musashi gets through to get to where he ends up. And Kojiro, it almost comes naturally. And a lot of that is because the barrier to entry for him is so much lower than to everybody else. I just loved seeing that difference in experience. And the good news is that ultimately it makes Musashi a better samurai because he has to go through struggle. And I'm a big believer of this. I think struggle is one of the greatest teachers ever. Like, if you want to learn something new, that struggle that you go through to learn that, like, that is obviously the most difficult part, but it is the part where you will learn the most. And I can definitely reference hundreds of examples of that in my own life. And I think Musashi is a perfect example of that. He is the one who has to struggle, but it ultimately serves him better in the end because he has to really work for it. And it really shows his grit as well. But Kojiro's an interesting character because he's also very arrogant, and he's very, you know, so-so. He thinks he can do whatever he wants, and he thinks he's the bee's knees. And to an extent, I guess he is. You know, people root for him because he is Kojiro. But I am a big fan of rooting for the underdog, and I think Musashi is also just generally a much more likable character. He has his own sense of identity, whereas Kojiro, he's just like any other samurai, but just very good at what he does. I mean, that's not to downplay his skill. He's very, very skilled, but I'd always put my money behind Musashi if I had to pick. I want to give a quick shout out to two more characters. We have Jotaro and we have Iori. So Jotaro is the first student of Musashi that he takes under his wing. Jotaro is hilarious. Like, I genuinely laughed out loud at many of the moments between Jotaro and Musashi, but also Jotaro and Otsu. Like, their interactions were just perfect. Towards the end of the book, we actually get less of Jotaro, and that really upset me because I just think he's such a hilariously important character. Not just for providing light relief, but I think he's such an eager, curious young man. I like seeing those types of characters, especially when we see Musashi transition from a young boy to an adult, and then we see Jotaro almost going through a similar transition. I just thought it was really smart, and I just wish we'd had more time with him. Like, I just adore him. The second one is Iori. So Iori we get later on in the book. He almost replaces Jotaro at a point. There's a point where Jotaro goes on to different arc in the story, and then Iori comes in and he kind of becomes Musashi's second in command, just like Jotaro was before that. And Iori is another really interesting young man. His father dies, and he basically sees Musashi as a fatherly figure. I just really like their characters and the way that they interacted with one another. Very different to the way that Musashi and Jotaro interact with each other, in my opinion. But I think he tries to teach him in a lot of the same ways. And I think one of the moments where I realised that Musashi is just very self-aware is where he realises that he could have done a lot better with Jotaro, and he ends up trying to improve to help Iori as well. So I really like these kind of two right hands that we have with Musashi, but at very different points in his life. And his treatment of those two characters at the different points in his life reflects how he works with them and talks to them and all of that. And I just thought that was a really great way to show growth. Next, I'm going to move on to themes on philosophy, because if I keep going on characters, this is going to be an over 1 hour long video, and I don't have time for that. I need to wrap this up relatively soon. But I think it's been pretty heavily alluded to. There's lots of themes and lots of philosophy. I want to do a separate video on the philosophy once I've read the Book of Five Rings by the man himself, Musashi, which he wrote himself. Expect that in a few weeks or months' time. But there's a lot around, you know, finding one's purpose, dedicating ourselves to our craft, our specific goals. One of the things that I really love about Japanese culture is that absolute dedication to being the best at whatever you set your mind to. No other culture, in my opinion, does it quite like the Japanese when it comes to that specific thing. That's why, you know, you look at Japan and you look at pictures of Tokyo or videos or whatever. There's a reason why the country is kind of one of the most structured, one of the most organized, one of the safest countries in the world. And it's because they really dedicate themselves to be the best at what they do. And I think Musashi is the perfect embodiment of that. There's this whole idea about being patient and practicing, and like I said, going through that struggle and waiting for the fruits of your labor, essentially. There's also the kind of idea of learning from others and using it to inform our own processes. This is something that really resonates with me. I like to learn from others, but I also like to make things my own, and kind of finding that happy medium. The other thing I identified was the idea of being alone and being solitary and enjoying your own company and being comfortable with your own thoughts. I find that a lot of people don't like being alone because maybe they don't want to face their true selves. To be fair, actually, since I was a child, that I've always been very happy with my own self, and seeing another character or reading another character who's also very happy with his own self and being his own kind of friend was really refreshing, and not something that I've ever read in any book, and I just loved it because it's something that I really identify with. And then the last thing is, or the last two things are the idea of revenge and why it's ultimately never worth it, and then the place of women as well. There's a lot of commentary on women. There is definitely some misogyny in this book, but it's to demonstrate a point. Japanese culture in many ways is very forward thinking, but in many other ways it's not. And definitely the role of women is something that hasn't evolved as much as you would probably think compared to, say, Western countries. I think we see a lot of that in this book. Obviously this was set, you know, 300-400 years ago, but you can see the kind of foundations of it in the 16th and 17th century. And I thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to stop there. Maybe let me raise some things that people won't like. I think the main thing that people won't like is the fact that it's just a very long book. If you want to read it, do what I suggested at the start and read it one book at a time. They don't end on cliffhangers. They're all pretty... One book is basically an arc for the characters. And so you can just read one book and then come to the next book in a few months' time. But if you're like me and you're almost reading it like it's a philosophical text, then read it all in one go, because I think you'll get a lot more out of it. But it does meander in places, and I think those middle books in particular, where it meanders a little bit, I loved it, but a lot of people are probably not going to have as much patience for it. I honestly just wish we'd had more, because I didn't want the book to end. All right, so I'm now going to read a few quotes. There were so many that I tabbed this book so much, it's actually insane. But I will read a few quotes now. The first quote: "You're going to find people from all over the country, everyone hungry for money and position. You won't make a name for yourself just doing what the next man does. You'll have to distinguish yourself in some way." Next one: "There's nothing more frightening than a half-baked do-gooder who knows nothing of the world, but takes it upon himself to tell the world what's good for it." This quote literally applies to many, many people in power. And just like in any kind of part of life, whether it's government, industry, business. This is why I'm debating getting rid of my Twitter, because the amount of people who think they know stuff when it's very abundantly clear that they don't, and then they talk about it as though they do, it's honestly shocking. Well, it's not that shocking actually, but anyway. The next quote: "Fighting isn't all there is to the art of war. The men who think that way and are satisfied to have food to eat and a place to sleep are mere vagabonds. A serious student is much more concerned with training his mind and disciplining his spirit than with developing martial skills. He has to learn about all sorts of things: geography, irrigation, the people's feelings, their manners and customs, their relationship with the lord of their territory. He wants to know what goes on inside the castle, not just what goes on outside of it. He wants essentially to go everywhere he can and learn everything he can." That is probably one of my most favourite quotes ever. So good. All right, we'll do 2 more. "True courage knows fear. It knows how to fear that which should be feared. Honest people value life passionately. They hang on to it like a precious jewel, and they pick the right time and place to surrender it, to die with dignity." Last one. "Whether people were great or not, there was not much variety in their inner life experience. Any difference lay merely in how they dealt with common human weaknesses." And that's it. That's my review for this absolutely incredible book. Obviously, I gave it a 5 stars. I would give it 1,000,000 stars. I would give it 1,000,000,000 stars if I could. This book spoke to me in a way that I've never expected. I just can't wait to reread it, and I really can't wait for some of you to pick it up, and I really hope you do after watching this review. In terms of what's next, because there's a lot of Musashi literature out there, I am going to read the Vagabond manga. I have it all. I bought it all. It's all on my tablet, and I'm ready to go. But I want to read the Book of 5 Rings first, and I have a bunch of his other writings as well. I'm going to read those first, and then I'm going to read Vagabond, the manga series, and then I actually think there is a anime as well, so I'll watch that like right at the end. But it was just phenomenal, life-changing in every single way possible, and I'm very, very thankful to Eiji Yoshikawa for writing such an incredible story. I will be reading Yoshikawa's other books as well. The next one is going to be Taiko, but I'm going to get to that probably not this year, probably next year, because I'm done with reading a 1,200 page epic. I think I'm going to limit myself to 1 epic a year. I think this year was Musashi. Next year will either be Taiko or Lonesome Dove. I don't know. And whichever one I don't read will be the year after that, because it took me 2 months. And in my defense, it's because I had a lot going on work-wise, so I could literally only read like 30, 40 minutes in the evening. And I ended up taking a massive break between the 6th book and the 7th book, because I knew it's the last book and I didn't want it to end. But look, it is what it is. Absolutely phenomenal. Go pick it up, go read it. And if you do, when you do, please, please, please keep me posted, because it is such a beautiful story. I know nobody who has read this book, and I want to talk about it. So ping me down in the comments below if you've read it. When you start reading it, ping me on any of my social media channels, which you can see in my description. And I really hope you enjoy this one. If you did like it, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one. Matane.